Anybody who visits London at the height of the summer will soon realise that the United Kingdom's capital city attracts sightseers from every far-flung corner of the globe. And what's on their list of attractions to see? 9 times out of 10, it'll be Buckingham Palace. Often followed by the Tower of London. And since the tragic death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1997, her former residence, Kensington Palace. In an age when the monarchy, British or otherwise, is accused of being an outdated institution, the tourists still flock in their millions to follow in the footsteps of royalty, both ancient and modern, to see for themselves the places where history was made. When it comes to listing the great kings and queens of the past, there are undoubtedly some that are better remembered than others. Richard the Lionheart, Henry VIII, and King George III are renowned for very different reasons, and when it comes to the ladies, Mary I, both of them one of England and one of Scotland, Elizabeth I, and Queen Victoria are as fascinating today as when they were alive. But there are many more characters worthy of investigation that are far less well known. So whether you want a basic who's who of the British monarchy to help you in the next pub quiz, or you'd like to find out how we got from feuding tribes of ancient Britons to the present day, prepare for a right royal romp through the history books, so that you never need to get your Henrys, Georges, Edwards, Richards, Marys and Williams mixed up again. Now, before we get down to the nitty-gritty of succession, it's well worth stepping back further in time to take a closer look at the British Isles just after the birth of Christ, when the Romans were masters of all they surveyed, including a large part of the United Kingdom. Of the native Brits, many of whom were Celts, there was considerable opposition to the Roman occupation, not least from the woman, often dubbed the Queen of the Ancient Britons, Boudica, or if you happen to be of a certain age, Boadicea. This fearsome warrior queen led her Iceni tribe to revolt against the Romans, and as neighbouring tribes of ancient Britons swelled their numbers, Boudica led a campaign that advanced from Colchester all the way to London and beyond, until the Romans finally managed to stop her in her tracks. Without actual records, it's hard to be precise about dates, but it's believed Boudica came to prominence in about AD 61. But even after her death, the Romans continued to have problems with the Celts. Rather than face the Scots in the north, who were as fearsome as the great warrior queen, in AD 122, the Roman Emperor Hadrian actually built a wall to keep the Scots out of England. This early separation of the neighbouring nations would continue for centuries, but more on that subject later. Eventually, the Roman occupation came to an end when the overstretched empire recalled their soldiers back to Rome, but waiting in the wings were the bloodthirsty Saxons, ready with invasion plans of their own. However, if legend is to be believed, one man united the tribes of the British Isles to resist the Saxon advances, and it's quite possible that he came from Wales. We've all heard of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table fighting for chivalry and honour in a lawless age. But try and find him in an historic timeline and you really will struggle. A true Celt, Arthur is thought to have lived in the 5th century AD, and this immediately gives us a major problem historically. Our images of King Arthur and his gallant knights belong to a much later age, but there's a very good reason for this. Way back in the 12th century, a bishop known as Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a history of the kings of Britain, and where the facts were a little sketchy, he simply filled in the blanks. Consequently, Geoffrey's rendition of the King Arthur story was set in the time that he knew best, his own, and we've had knights in shining armour and damsels in distress ever since. Fascinating as this may or may not be, it just goes to prove that we need to view history books with care, and especially when it comes to royalty, because what may appear as fact might well indeed be fiction. Therefore, with images of King Arthur's mortal remains sailing away with the Lady of the Lake, and his sword Excalibur disappearing beneath the waters of Dosemary Pool, we'll move on to a time when history is far more reliably documented. After the demise of Arthur, the Saxon occupiers in waiting invaded, and by 613 had driven the Celts out of England. 7 kingdoms were then established: Kent, Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, Wessex, Mercia and Northumbria, with each having its own king. Eventually, one of the kings, Egbert of Wessex, took control of all 7 kingdoms, after much fighting, to be the first King of England in 829, with his son and grandsons succeeding him. In fact, one of the earliest kings most of us will have heard of was Alfred the Great, and he was a grandson of Egbert, but in popular culture is much better remembered for being a very bad cook. Alfred became King of England in 1871, and by all accounts was a well-educated man who, as a child, had been taken to visit the Pope in Rome, not an inconsiderable achievement in the 9th century. However, England was once more under threat of invasion, this time by the Danes, and this is how the story of the burnt cakes came about. Alfred escaped an attack by the Danes in the West Country, and legend has it that he sought refuge with peasants living on the Somerset levels, while he contemplated how to save his kingdom. One day, when the peasant's wife went out on errands, Alfred was left in charge of her baking. But he was so caught up with matters of state, he forgot all about the cooking, and was duly chastised when the woman returned to burnt cakes. Whether true or not, this is the story that has gone down in the history books, when Alfred was in fact, as his name suggests, a much greater king than this footnote gives him credit for. After Alfred, and a succession of Eds of all varieties, including an elder, a fair and a martyr, the next king that most of us will have heard of is Ethelred the Unready, who came to the throne in 978. However, it's a case of meaning being lost in translation, because Unriad, which is what he was actually called, means poorly counselled in Anglo-Saxon, and it would seem that the unfortunate Ethelred might have benefited from some good advice. The Danes were still on the rampage, and Ethelred was no match for the Viking leader Svein Forkbeard, who seized the English throne in 1013. but Forkbeard's reign was short-lived, as he died about 5 weeks later, and despite his wonderful name referring to the way he wore his beard, it's his son Canute who is much better remembered, and all because of another much-loved royal legend. King Canute ruled England from 1016 after a brief reversion to Ethelred's son, and he was one of the best monarchs the country had ever known. Wise and fair, Canute modernised the laws of the land. Although many believed he considered himself so important, he attempted to command the seas and the turn of the tide. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. Tired of his courtiers' flattery, when one insisted Canute could order the tide not to come in, Canute went down to the beach, set up his throne at the water's edge, and of course got wet, proving that he had no power over the elements, while at the same time exposing the courtier as very foolish indeed. When Canute died, he was succeeded firstly by his son Harold, and then his other son, Harthacnut. When he died, the throne passed again back to the Saxon line, and another son of Ethelred the Unready, who was also the half-brother of Harthacnut, known as Edward the Confessor, a title which was bestowed upon him because of his great piety. Nevertheless, Edward failed to produce a son and heir, and this caused a real problem, especially as it seems he promised the English throne to his brother-in-law Harold Godwinson and his distant cousin William, Duke of Normandy. Edward the Confessor died in 1066, a year familiar to us all because of the Battle of Hastings. When Harold became king, cousin William over in France was not content to give up his claim to the English throne. William was also a descendant of Alfred the Great, and when he set out to conquer England, there was no stopping him. Harold was killed in the Battle of Hastings, depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry as being shot by an arrow through the eye, and the event heralded the Norman period of English history, quite literally changing the face of the nation during William's well-documented Norman conquests. When William was crowned king at the newly constructed Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066, he was ready to take control of the nation. Anglo-Saxon estates were confiscated and granted to Norman nobles, and needless to say, the natives got very restless. William and his nobles put down many revolts, building their characteristic castles and fortresses all over the land, including the original White Tower of the Tower of London, constructed in 1078. And to ensure his supremacy, William is also remembered for the compilation of the Domesday Book in 1085, an early form of census that recorded how land was being used, and more importantly for the Norman treasury, how much tax could be levied on the people of England. Not that William lived long enough to personally reap the benefits, as he died in 1087 after falling from his horse in France. It's important to remember that these early kings were military leaders as well as monarchs, and with lands in France and England, William certainly had his work cut out. After William I came his son William II, known as William Rufus because of his ruddy complexion. He too was kept busy, especially as the Scottish king Malcolm III tried, on more than one occasion, to invade his English neighbour, as did Welsh rebels unhappy with the Norman nobles occupying the border castles of the marshes. William Rufus, however, was not killed in battle, but in a hunting accident while out with friends in the New Forest, although the conspiracy theorists have a different version of events. Henry I, William's youngest brother, was crowned at Westminster Abbey in 1100, and it's been suggested that he may have had a hand in his brother's untimely death. Henry, nonetheless, pledged good governance and wisely neutralised any threat from Scotland by marrying the daughter of the troublesome, by now deceased, Malcolm III. But not everything ran to plan. His brother, the Duke of Normandy, attempted to overthrow Henry, and the king lost his only son William, who was drowned at sea. Now this is where it gets interesting. Henry I had a daughter, Matilda, who as a female was not expected to inherit the throne, but the king persuaded the barons to accept her as his lawful successor. This may have been fine in theory, but when Henry died in 1135, Matilda was usurped by her cousin, Stephen. Matilda may not have been crowned queen, but she didn't give up her claim to her father's throne without a fight. These were turbulent years characterised by civil war, only brought to a satisfactory conclusion when Stephen agreed to name Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, as his heir. Consequently, when Stephen died in 1154, he was the last Norman king of England, as Henry II became the first of the Plantagenets. Now it's pretty obvious the Normans came from Normandy, but if you're wondering where the Plantagenets came from, it's actually all down to nickname. Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, Henry's father, always wore a sprig of flowering broom, Planta genista, and this is how he was known. When Henry II was crowned King of England in 1154, aged 21, he was already Count of Anjou and Touraine, as well as being Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, which meant his French territories were more extensive than those owned by the King of France. Add to that the throne of England, and Henry's Angevin Empire stretched from the Solway Firth to the Pyrenees. So far we've focused on the monarchs and not mentioned their queens, but in the case of Henry II, his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, has to be one of the most fascinating historical characters of all time. The pair were married in France in 1152, the bride being 11 years her handsome groom senior. Eleanor had first been married to the King of France, but had been granted an annulment because they were so closely related, and when Henry came to the English throne, he brought with him a charismatic queen who was centuries ahead of her time. Just as Alfred's remembered for burning the cakes, there's one incident that is synonymous with Henry II, the bloody murder of Thomas à Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. As monarch, Henry had been determined to control the power of the church, and appointed his friend Becket to the influential post of Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. But Becket would not be swayed from his religious principles, and for 8 years thwarted the king's reforms, enraging Henry so much that on one occasion he screamed out, "Will not someone rid me of this turbulent priest?" Immediately, 4 of Henry's knights took him at his word and set off for Canterbury and murdered Becket at the high altar of the cathedral, and whether this was the king's intention or a tragic error, Henry II has gone down in the history books with blood on his hands. Other notable achievements in Henry's reign included the establishment of trial by jury and the acquisition of the title Lord of all Ireland to go with all the others in 1171 after a successful invasion. However, Henry II didn't die a happy man. His constant battle with his wife resulted in her being confined to the French castle of Chinon for years, and, not surprisingly, she sided with her son Richard in battle against her husband. Neither was his relationship with his sons much better, and he refused to name an heir until his dying breath in 1189, when he bequeathed the Angevin Empire to his 3rd son, Richard. And so we come to one of the best-loved English kings of all time, Richard the Lionheart, friend of Robin Hood, Crusader knight, and darling of literature. But just as some kings have been misrepresented as poor monarchs, Richard benefited from an overinflated reputation. Of the 10 years Richard ruled, he only spent 7 months of that time in England, while he plundered the nation's coffers and increased taxation to pay for his crusades in the Holy Land. Interestingly, it's Richard's younger brother John who generally gets the blame for this heavy taxation, especially in the legends of Robin Hood. Richard the Lionheart was only 41 when he died in 1199, shot by an archer in France while he was in search of buried treasure, and his tomb can be found in Fontevrault Abbey, next to those of his father Henry and his mother Eleanor, in the heart of the French countryside. Like Henry II, Richard named his heir as he was dying, and it was his brother John who has gone down in history, perhaps unfairly, as being as bad a king as Richard was good. King John's best known for signing the Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215 to appease the warring barons, and this historic document was crucial in the establishment of English common law. When John died a year later, the English throne passed to his son, crowned King Henry III in 1216 at the age of 9 under a regency. However, when Henry took full control in 1227, he proved to be a most unpopular king, and the barons, quietened by Magna Carta, were soon on the rampage again. It fell to Henry's eldest son, Prince Edward, to put the rebellion down, which he did with great relish. When Henry III died in 1272, Edward was on crusade in the Holy Land, but returned to be crowned king in 1274. Edward I is often known by the name Longshanks because he was very tall, and he was also renowned for his savagery towards opponents. The Welsh certainly suffered at his hands when Wales was incorporated into his domain, and he was the first to appoint his eldest son Prince of Wales in 1301, a tradition that continues to this day. However, he's most famous for his barbaric treatment of the Scots. After deposing the Scottish king in 1296, he stole the Stone of Destiny from Scone Palace, a historic artefact used in the Scots coronation ceremony, and took it to Westminster Abbey, where it remained until its return to Edinburgh Castle in 1996. Nevertheless, when Edward I invaded Scotland, he didn't quite have it all his own way, thanks to the efforts of a now famous Scotsman by the name of William Wallace, whose armies beat the English at Stirling Bridge in 1297. Edward did defeat the Scots a year later at Falkirk, when Wallace was captured and taken to London, where he was executed. But when Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scotland in 1306, the oppressed nation north of the border served notice that the English now had a fight on their hands. Upon the death of Edward I in 1307, ironically on his way north for another go at invading Scotland, his son Edward II, the first ever Prince of Wales, was crowned king. The new king didn't have the stomach for fighting the Scots, and Robert the Bruce assured Scottish independence in 1314 when he routed the English at the Battle of Bannockburn. Yet Edward II's most dangerous adversary proved to be his wife, Queen Isabella, who ran off with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and the pair seized power in the name of the king's eldest son, again called Edward. Edward II was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, where he was brutally murdered in 1327 on the orders of Isabella, and has gone down in history as one of the most unfortunate kings of all time. When Edward III finally seized power from the regency of Roger Mortimer in 1330, his 50-year reign proved him to be an affable king, much loved by his people. However, when he died in 1377, Edward's most notable contribution to the history books was his declaration of himself as heir to the French throne, starting what would become the 100 Years' War. Sadly though, his eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, predeceased his father, but having produced a son of his own before his untimely demise, Richard II came to the throne at the age of 10. Many believe Richard to have been a weak king, not least because of the play written by William Shakespeare about him. However, he crossed swords with his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who deposed Richard in 1399 to become Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster, a branch of the Plantagenets. But his prize proved to be something of a poisoned chalice, with nothing but revolts and treasury shortages, and he died a rather disappointed man in 1430. Succeeded by his son Henry V, Henry IV would no doubt have been extremely proud of his heir. After reviving the 100 Years' War with France, his armies were victorious at the Battle of Agincourt, again made famous by one of Shakespeare's plays. As a result, upon his death in 1422, his son Henry VI became king, inheriting both the English and French thrones. Henry VI was a good man, but a weak king, and during his reign the English were thrown out of France after a campaign led in the first instance by Joan of Arc. Plantagenet House of York also went into battle with Henry in the War of the Roses, which broke out in 1455, resulting in the Duke of York, the future Edward IV, deposing Henry in 1461. After much toing and froing, Henry VI was restored to the throne, but only for a very short time, as he was murdered in the Tower of London, very possibly by the Duke of Gloucester, who's also suspected of murdering Henry's son, who by rights would have become king. Consequently, Edward IV was restored to the English throne in 1471, the first king of the House of York. Despite his interrupted reign, Edward proved to be an able king who brought peace and prosperity to England. However, when he fell out with his brother George, the unfortunate sibling was found murdered in the Tower of London, something that was proving to be a regular occurrence. When Edward IV died in 1483, his young son Edward succeeded him. However, the boy's uncle claimed the child illegitimate and seized the throne for himself. The king in question was Richard III, and when Edward V and his younger brother, who were living in the Tower of London at the time, disappeared, suspicions certainly fell upon the new king. Richard III doesn't have the best of PR in royal history, and Shakespeare certainly did little to improve matters with his play, which portrays the king as a hunchback. However, his 2 years on the throne are to this day a source of much fascination, but when he died at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, defeated by one Henry Tudor, the War of the Roses were at an end, as a new age was about to begin. Henry VII, with his Lancastrian ancestry, married Elizabeth of York in 1486, uniting the two branches of the Plantagenet family as Tudors. But when his eldest son Arthur died in 1503, leaving his young widow Catherine of Aragon in the care of Henry VII, a remarkable chapter in history was about to be written. Henry VII died in 1509, and his second son, Henry VIII, succeeded him. After receiving a dispensation from the Pope, the new king married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, in the same year, in accordance with his father's wishes. These were early days for the new Tudor dynasty, and Henry was aware that he needed to produce an undisputed son and heir, an issue that would dominate his whole life, and create a religious rift throughout the nation that would cost many their lives. Dutifully, Queen Catherine produced child after child, including 2 boys who died in infancy. However, the only surviving child was Mary, born in 1516. As Catherine, who was older than her husband, appeared less and less likely to produce an heir, Henry applied to the Pope for an annulment, claiming that his marriage was cursed because Catherine had been his brother's widow. When the Pope refused, Henry had the Act of Supremacy passed in 1533, making himself head of the English Church, breaking from Roman Catholicism, so a divorce could be granted. Henry went on to marry a further 5 times, and, as the rhyme goes, his wives were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, and here's a whistle-stop tour of Who's Who. Henry married Anne Boleyn in 1533, but her only surviving child was a daughter, Elizabeth, and Anne was beheaded for adultery in 1536. Next, Henry married Jane Seymour, just 11 days after Anne's execution, and in 1537 she gave birth to Edward, the male child Henry had been waiting for. But Jane's triumph was temporary. She died within weeks from postnatal complications. Henry next married Anne of Cleves on the strength of a portrait, but when he met her, she didn't fulfill his expectations, and although he couldn't stop the wedding in 1540, the marriage was annulled 6 months later, as Henry claimed it hadn't been consummated. Shortly after Anne of Cleves, Henry married the young, vivacious Catherine Howard in 1540, but, like Anne Boleyn, she was accused of adultery and beheaded. The last of Henry's wives, Catherine Parr, who he married in 1543, managed to avoid the fates of her predecessors until the king's death in 1547, only to die in childbirth a year later after marrying the brother of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. Although, as Henry wished, his son Edward VI succeeded him, he was just a child of 9, and the nation was governed by 2 protectors. However, when Edward contracted tuberculosis, his days were numbered, and he died in 1553 at the age of 15, leaving England quite literally in turmoil. The Duke of Northumberland, the then Protector of England, when Edward fell sick, persuaded the boy to name Lady Jane Grey as his heir, in order to keep the nation Protestant. Needless to say, Henry VIII's daughter Mary believed she had a much greater claim to the throne, but was a devout Catholic, just as her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been. A pawn in a very dangerous game, the 16-year-old Lady Jane was manipulated onto the throne of England as what history often calls the 9 Days Queen. But when Mary and her Catholic supporters arrived in London, the unfortunate Lady Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London until her execution in 1554. As soon as Queen Mary I took the throne, she set about restoring England to the Catholic faith, which she finalised in 1554, the same year that she married Philip of Spain. Many Protestants who refused to convert to Catholicism were burnt as heretics, and this is why this particular queen has gone down in history as Bloody Mary. Nevertheless, Mary suffered with the same anxiety as her father over producing an heir, and she failed to give birth to a live child. To make matters worse, her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, had many supporters keen to depose Mary in her favour, which would mean a return to a Protestant England, something the Queen couldn't countenance, and Elizabeth did well to come out of the Tower of London, where she was imprisoned at one stage alive. When Mary died in 1558 at the age of 42, abandoned by Philip of Spain and childless, the crown passed to Elizabeth, and the Church of England was quickly restored in 1559. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had many suitors, but she chose not to marry, claiming she was married to England. The Virgin Queen, as she became known, fought off the Spanish Armada, but the Catholics were a constant threat, and Elizabeth's cousin Mary, the Catholic Queen of Scotland, was used as a pawn in the fight for religious supremacy, just as Lady Jane Grey had been. There's often confusion about Mary I of England and Mary I of Scotland, but for Elizabeth, Mary Queen of Scots, her cousin, was one of her biggest problems. Eventually, faced with endless conspiracies with Mary seemingly at the heart of them, Elizabeth, who had kept Mary moving from castle to castle as her prisoner, finally signed her death warrant and had her executed in 1587. Elizabeth I reigned for an incredible 45 years, but when she died in 1603, the inevitable problem of who would succeed the Virgin Queen meant the end of the Tudors. Ironically, it was the son of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, James VI of Scotland, a Stuart, who became James I of England, at last uniting the nations to be governed by the same sovereign. The people had loved Elizabeth, but James I was not a popular king, and on the 5th of November 1605, Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament and the king. When James I died in 1625, his son Charles I succeeded him, and was, like his father before him, a great believer in the divine right of kings. Charles thought he was only answerable to God and no one else, but eventually this resulted in civil war, with the parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell in 1642. When Charles and his royalists were defeated, the king was tried and executed, leaving Britain without a monarchy for the period of interregnum between 1649 and 1660, when the nation was overseen by the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. But Cromwell, just like the kings in whose footsteps he'd followed, planned his son to succeed him. However, Richard Cromwell simply wasn't up to the task, and in 1660 the monarch was restored when the son of Charles I, yes, you've guessed it, Charles II, returned to carry on the Stuart line. Charles II was glamorous, and brought an element of fun back to life after Oliver Cromwell's Puritanism, but he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed in 1685, and, with no issue, the throne passed to his brother James II, a practicing Catholic who intended to restore links with Rome, even if it meant going to war. However, when his wife gave birth to a son, a Catholic heir to the throne, tensions escalated. With the national crises again developing over religion, the Protestant William of Orange was invited to take the English throne, to jointly rule with his wife Mary, the daughter of James II. The royal couple were crowned in 1689, after James II went to live in exile in France. Sadly, William and Mary had no children to follow them, and after Mary's death from smallpox in 1694 at Kensington Palace, William ruled on alone until his own death in 1702. But the year before, the Act of Settlement was passed to ensure a Protestant succession, and when Queen Anne, the second daughter of James II, came to the throne in 1702, by which time all of her 18 children had predeceased her, the nearest Protestant relation was the German Sophia, Electress of Hanover, who became her heir. Despite all the efforts made for a smooth Protestant succession, Sophia died shortly before Queen Anne in 1714, so her son George, who spoke no English, came to London to be crowned the first Hanoverian king. This was far from popular with the British people, and with a Jacobite rising starting in Scotland in 1715, planning to restore the Old Pretender, the Catholic son of James II, to the throne, all was not quite as straightforward with the Hanoverian succession as had been hoped. When George I died in 1727, he was succeeded by his son George II, despite the fact that as Prince of Wales he'd fought constantly with his father. And history repeated itself as the new king's quarrels with his own son Frederick, Prince of Wales, were legendary. And as well as disharmony on the domestic front, George II was still far from popular with the people of Britain. When the Jacobites made another attempt to restore the Stuart line by putting Charles Edward Stuart, the Bonnie Prince, son of the Old Pretender, on the throne, they came incredibly close to succeeding. Bonnie Prince Charlie landed in Scotland in 1745, and after a conclusive victory over the British army at the Battle of Preston Pans, he marched south and got as far as Derby, with London in his sights. But a moment of indecision resulted in a retreat with disastrous consequences, and the rebellion ended at the bloody Battle of Culloden, where the victorious British took their revenge. The Bonnie Prince fled to Skye, rowed by the lovely Flora MacDonald, before escaping to France, and the Hanoverian George II continued his reign. It's possible George II wasn't too troubled when his heir, Frederick, the Prince of Wales, who he loathed, died unexpectedly after allegedly being hit on the head by a cricket ball, especially as he'd already ensured the succession, having given the old king a grandson. George II died in 1760, and his grandson became the next George in line, the third, and he was the first Hanoverian king born in Britain. Many believe George III was mad, and he certainly showed all the signs of being so on a number of occasions. What he actually suffered from was a physical condition called porphyria that gave every indication of mental illness. But like all the Georges who'd preceded him, George III had a poor relationship with his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, who he considered a disgrace because of his wild living. Nevertheless, the future George IV had to take over as regent because of his father's ill health between 1811 and the king's death in 1820. When finally crowned as George IV, the prince who'd waited so long to be king had a relatively short reign of just over 2 years, and one of his main claims to fame is the fact that he transformed Buckingham House into the beautiful royal palace we know and love today. And finally, after George IV, Britain got a king with a different name, William IV, his predecessor's brother. Despite speculation about fathering numerous offspring, George IV had only one legitimate daughter, who died in 1817, leaving no issue. William IV was 64 when he became king. Despite having plenty of illegitimate offspring, he had no issue to legally succeed him. When he died in 1837, it was the end of the line for the Hanoverian men, and the crown passed to an 18-year-old niece of William IV by the name of Victoria. For historians, the reign of Queen Victoria is a great source of fascination. she managed to restore the popularity of the monarchy in Great Britain. When Victoria married the German Prince Albert, to honour him, the royal house became known as Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Their happy union produced 9 children, who would marry into all the major European royal families. It's hard to find much Queen Victoria had in common with her Hanoverian predecessors, except that both she and Albert found the wild behaviour of their eldest son, the Prince of Wales, intolerable, resulting in a very strained relationship. When Prince Albert died in 1861, the Queen was distraught and blamed the behaviour of the Prince of Wales for her husband's death. Waiting to become Edward VII was going to go on for many years, and when Queen Victoria died in 1901, after more than 50 years on the throne, the new king was destined for a much shorter reign. As the 20th century dawned, Edward VII brought with him a sense of freedom to the people of Britain after the constraints of the Victorian age. But when he died in 1910, the threat of war with Germany was looming large. George V had never imagined he would become king as the second son of Edward VII. But when his older brother died unexpectedly, he took his responsibilities very seriously and was a popular king at a time when his German ancestry could have been a problem. The German Kaiser, William II, causing all the problems, was actually a cousin of the British king, who considerately changed the name of the royal house from the German Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, showing precisely where his loyalties lay. Nevertheless, World War I, fought between 1914 and 1918, resulted in the king suffering ill health in the post-war years, and when he died at Sandringham in 1936, another war with Germany was threatening to disturb the peace. At such a difficult time politically, everyone had high hopes of the new king, Edward VIII, the eldest son of George V. But his love for the American divorcee Wallis Simpson resulted in his abdication in December 1936. The responsibility for saving the British monarchy on this occasion fell to the quietly spoken Duke of York and his young family, and with little time for preparation, he became King George VI as Britain again headed for war. George VI had 2 daughters, and the eldest, Elizabeth, became the heiress presumptive, with more time than her father to get used to the idea of becoming queen. Again, like his father before him, George VI found himself king of a nation at war in 1939, and the 7 years of the Second World War took a considerable toll on his health. Yet the young Princess Elizabeth could never have guessed she would lose her father and become queen quite as soon as she did. When George VI died in 1952, the new Queen Elizabeth II promised herself to the nation, and her coronation in Westminster Abbey in 1953 was watched by people everywhere as it was televised. Moving into the media age, Queen Elizabeth II has seen her family face a hungry world press, constantly searching for the latest royal news stories. In 1981, her eldest son, Charles, the Prince of Wales, married Lady Diana Spencer, and their every move was under scrutiny. After securing the succession with 2 sons, princes William and Harry, the marriage sadly ended in divorce in 1996, and a year later Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a tragic car accident on the streets of Paris. As a result, the Queen has carried the responsibility for leading her family into the 21st century, as she still works tirelessly to guide the future heirs to the throne, as they too face a lifetime of service to the nation. And on that very positive note, as the next generation of the British monarchy steps into the breach, as William Shakespeare so eloquently put it, who can say what the future might bring? We've all come a long way from Boudica, the queen of the ancient Britons, leaving a wake of destruction wherever she went, to Elizabeth II leading gently by example, leaving only happy memories for those of her adoring people fortunate enough to meet her. As the history books tell, even with royalty, things don't always go necessarily to plan with happy ever after endings. But one thing's absolutely for certain: a monarchy that can adapt to the age in which they live will always survive and get stronger, whatever might have gone before.